Today we are going to be talking about this book up here on the screen, Among the Braves. And we are fortunate to have the terrific writers of this book. I describe them as terrific writers, and you'll hear why in just a moment. But the book itself is extraordinary, and I can't recommend it enough. I really learned a lot from this book. I also very much it's a page turner. It's not your usual book. We meet one of the protagonists right at the outset, and we follow him and others throughout 2019 and 2020. It's really quite extraordinary. How did you decide that you would follow a few individuals through their development, how they became involved in protests? And so how did you decide, and then how did you decide which individuals? Because this story, the story of Hong Kong, is told through these individuals.
Shibani and I were both, we're also, not to spoil any big reveal in the book, we're married. And so we worked on a lot of stuff together during the protest. And I think we both thought that there was still a lot more that we wanted to write. And part of that was because when the national security law came from Beijing was also almost exactly around the time that COVID started to kind of reveal itself, mostly, at first, obviously in China, in Hong Kong. So there was just kind of this really hard stop to what was happening, and the fact that also a lot of people shifted their focus globally on the news to the public health crisis that was starting to unfold. I don't think anyone anticipated it to be as big and obviously as life-altering as it was. So I think that was part of it, that we had done some writing, that we had done a lot of reporting, but then there was also this ending that didn't seem totally fitting. So we wanted to kind of continue on and do that through the book. And the characters, we wanted to choose people that represented different parts of the protest movement. They kind of illuminated different aspects of what we saw was important. And then one of the characters, Reverend Xu Yuming, is an older individual, much older than the other people that we focus on. And he was chosen because he'd been at all these kind of important events during Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement and on the mainland in '89. And then through 2003 and 2012, 2014, 2019. And so he had this very long arc. And I think he fit well with kind of explaining a lot of the backstory and kind of where the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong sort of started from.
That's terrific. But and you also latched on to a journalist?
Yes. You were talking about that?
Yeah. So, and as Tim mentioned, having Reverend Xu, like a character who was, much older, right, could like take us through sort of the birth and how the modern pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong came to be. Obviously, 2019 in Hong Kong, was that moment of a lot of global focus and attention, but we wanted to kind of situate that in history and add the appropriate context. But I think we still saw our book's biggest contribution as sort of explaining, why the young people really took to the streets in 2019. So we made them sort of the bulk of the focus, with having three younger people, only one sort of from the older generation. Those three one of them is a young man called Tommy, who at the end of the book, or we sort of preview it in the prologue, so I'm not giving too much away, but is trying to escape Hong Kong by boat to get to Taiwan, because he had been arrested and had a lot of charges kind of pile up against him, and was looking for a way out. And to us, I think that really was like such a jarring and stark thing that somebody would like leave Hong Kong, this incredibly sort of developed city, a place where asylum seekers and refugees actually try to get to, and gamble on their fate, in the Taiwan Strait, right? I mean, it was really, I think, something that crystallized to us like quite how far Hong Kong had sort of fallen. And the other two, the first was Fin Lau, who was an online activist based in the UK when the movement started in 2019. To us, he represented the kind of decentralized online nature of the movement. And we really wanted to talk about that aspect, right? Like how much can stuff that happens online and those discussions happening on online forums, can that really translate into action on the street, stuff happening in Washington around sanctions and so on, and it really could, and that's what we saw in 2019 that was pretty remarkable about Hong Kong. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, Gwyneth Ho is a journalist who sort of rose to prominence during the movement because she was involved in such key seminal moments, became herself a victim of some of the violence we saw from kind of the pro-Beijing side during the movement, particularly on the July 21st of 2019, which was a pretty important date in the history of the protest movement. And she's the only one in our book who decides to stay in Hong Kong, even though she knows that certainly would mean that she would be jailed.
And she was, and is.
Yes.
And so you get a sense of some of these stories through which we come to understand the rise of these demonstrations, what brought people into these movements, what motivated them, what their principal concerns were. And not all of these folks started out saying, I want to bring democracy or something like that to Hong Kong. Many of them were apolitical, focused on career, focused on other kinds of things. So it's really, really quite interesting. You also get these portrayals of members of organized political parties, people who serve in government. You also have that old guard of Martin Lee and some of these others. And you get introduced also to some of the folks who were very prominent, not just in 2019, but in the earlier demonstrations as well, from Joshua Wong, Benny Tai, and some of the others. So the book is really rich in introducing us to these people, showing how they interact with others, how they deal with their families. Because one of the striking things is this question of how these protests in some cases divided families. And so it's really quite interesting. Now, you've already highlighted that this notion of a legacy of protest. And in the book, this really comes through, that Hong Kong, certainly there were protests during China's Cultural Revolution and things along those lines. But 1989, the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square and in 70 other Chinese cities, people in Hong Kong paid attention. And so maybe you could say something about that, how the movements on the mainland wound up in some ways sparking demonstrations in Hong Kong and an appreciation for what made Hong Kong distinct.
So I think part of it is certainly the backdrop under which it happened, not just the immediate aftermath of what happened in Tiananmen, but in the years leading up to it, there had been negotiations over the China Joint British Declaration, over the handover of Hong Kong. So there was definitely some, anxiety amongst the people in Hong Kong. One, because of the unknown of what that would bring. Two, because they had been largely cut out of these discussions, right? The people in Hong Kong really had no say in kind of how that was hammered out. It was done by Thatcher's government and some sinologists around her, and then Deng Xiaoping and some people around him were largely, the Hong Kong involvement largely kind of a window dressing of some elites that were allowed to kind of be part of little bits of it. So I think there was a lot of anxiety leading up to '89, and then when the protests started across China and then in Beijing and Tiananmen Square, the crackdown kind of highlighted to a lot of people or cemented to a lot of people that this was going to be their new governance, was going to be someone that would kill their own people and put down these protests in such a kind of violent manner, right? So I think that was shocking to a lot of people, playing again, like I said, on the anxieties that were already there. And it reverberated hugely in Hong Kong, and there was massive protests then, millions of people. But then I think also one of the more interesting bits of it, aside from the street protests, there was a lot of, even before the crackdown happened, a lot of support from Hong Kong going to the mainland. A lot of people sending heaps of money, supplies, going up there to stand in solidarity with the people were the students with the protesters, and then afterwards, in the immediate kind of aftermath of the crackdown, Hong Kong and some activists that, Reverend Chu in the book is one of them. There's a few other older ones that are still around now, played a big role in what became known as Operation Yellowbird, which was moving dissidents that were wanted in China on this wanted list that was put out by the Chinese government, moving them, smuggling them essentially from China to Hong Kong, and then having them moved from Hong Kong to third countries, to the UK and to the US, but primarily to France, really, where a lot of them were resettled. So there was a lot of solidarity, a lot of connections. At the time, the Yellowbird bit, maybe we'll write our second book about that, because it's a fascinating time in history when you have, the British police officers, assisting. You had the triads played a role in smuggling some of these people. So I think you saw a society come together in a very kind of interesting way. And it's not, the story, I think there's still bits of it that aren't totally, told.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic story. And in the book, you mentioned 1984, the negotiations between the Thatcher government and Deng Xiaoping's group, which resulted in this joint declaration. And you can read the joint declaration at our website together with the basic law, and a lot of the documents that they make reference to are available at the website. But there's a great quotation from Emily Lau, where she challenges the British Prime Minister. I don't know if you could say something about that, sort of the original betrayal.
Yeah, the quote is the quote. I mean, she was a journalist at the time of the negotiations and the signing of the Sino-British Declaration, and then chose to go into politics later, actually kind of foreshadowing Gwyneth, one of our main characters, sort of decision making as well. But she asked Thatcher, within politics, national interest is the highest form of morality. And that was a quote that really kind of stuck with us as we kept researching and looking through this book, right? And that was something that was posed to Thatcher in 84, right? But could equally have been posed to the Trump administration and people around them, in 2019 and 2022. And I think that we saw, quite a lot of parallels throughout history, right? Where there are all these big power negotiations and big power interests in Hong Kong, but the people of Hong Kong are not sort of central and key to that discussion, right? Hong Kong is just sort of like, it's like a geopolitical football, but not something that like there is actually like deep concern or like a willingness to actually like do something for the people, right? And we saw that, I think, throughout history from different countries and different powers.
Yeah, and you highlight that in 1989, where one of the heroes in the book, he only gets one line, but essentially he's the French consul general who said, "Bring them to me."
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a fascinating story about, we have this massive, awareness of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is one of the most famous cities anywhere. It's basically kind of a poster child for a global city, and yet when Hong Kong's in a particular place, the great powers get very deferential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like Hong Kong is such a good talking point, right, for so many Western governments. But I think we wanted to kind of, raise the issue of like when push comes to shove, right, when things are really sort of difficult and governments have to make difficult decisions, life or death really for people. How far are they willing to go? I think that's something that we saw, throughout.
Yeah, hard choices from beginning to end. But one of the things, again, that comes out of '89 is the annual commemoration of the sacrifice, the demonstrations on the mainland. The only Chinese city where they can happen is Hong Kong. And that's one of the ways that this notion of this is what we do, we're in Hong Kong. Maybe you could say something about that culture of protest or legacy of protest.
Yeah, I mean, we cited in a book, but it became, so well known that the protests in Hong Kong were kind of happened so frequently in the rallies and, street corner booths of politicians, that at one edition of the Lonely Planet travel guide, has a bit about the protests in there, and that if you're in Hong Kong and there's a protest going on, you should go look at it because it's this kind of festive demonstration with lots of slogans, and they became, I guess, so linked to the city that even a travel guide would highlight them as something that you should check out if you were there. So yeah, I think that that certainly grew. I mean, not totally, but grew in a big way. Out of '89. And then also in 2003 when there was huge protests. Yeah, so I think that and these are kind of just the ones that get covered by the media and attention. But if you've lived in Hong Kong or visited, pretty much any weekend you can find a protest about something that's going on, or could rather. And so yeah, I think that was also something we wanted to highlight, that this wasn't just like a one-off kind of occurrence, and not even counting 2014 obviously, which many people know, but just kind of how protests became ingrained, almost kind of like weekly occurrence in the city.
And they actually achieved a lot, right?
Yeah.
Throughout Hong Kong's sort of early handover years, there was a sense that there was sort of agency among the people, and something they could achieve by taking to the streets. The best example would be in 2003 when Beijing tried to impose Article 23, which is a domestic security law, which has come back today as well. There were massive protests, and they stopped that from happening and massively embarrassed the government, and there were people who had to step down and quit because of it, right? And I think that all of these notched together, right? Until 2014, where Hong Kong people again, in that context where there was huge unhappiness with Beijing's decision coming down, which essentially said Hong Kong would not be able to choose their own leader, people were like, okay, well, protests worked before. They should work again. This time we'll change our tactics. We'll lay siege to city streets. We'll do the occupation thing, and it didn't, right? So I think that colored so much of what we saw in 2019, where that there was so many, that there was a perception that victories could be gained from street movements, street protests, and then they weren't, right? And I think that created a lot of the dynamics that we saw unfolding on the streets in 2019.
Yeah, the Hong Kong Federation of Youth did, I don't know if they do it every year, but they did a survey in 2017. And about half of the young people that they surveyed, said yes when asked, does the government listen to public opinion? Can it affect government policies? They've just done that again, and the folks who answer positively to that now number 30%. And it's one data point, but that question. Now, you were talking about the success of these protests in the early part of the 21st century.
Yeah.
That now Hong Kong has been formally returned to Chinese control after 1997, and then you have these protests against this Article 23, the security measure, and then you have other protests about the government's handling of different things, and they yield success. So the lesson learned is take to the streets, and you can affect this. One of the things that comes out in the book is that, but also protests made routine in the sense that there's a system.
Yeah.
You put in a request, and the police, as long as they're not opposed, let it go forward.
Yeah.
Say something about that and how that is part of the story of Hong Kong. The notion that it's not necessary, you may be opposed to particular things in that the government has done, but not the idea of the government.
Yeah, you essentially applied for a permit from the police to get a letter of no objection for a protest. They would, sometimes bring in the leaders of various groups that were organizing, ask them some questions on, how many people they're expecting, their route, and then almost always would just sign off on them. So there was official participation, because they're the ones granting the access. They're the ones walking down the road with the tape, cordoning off certain lanes of the road if the protest got big enough. So there was, it was not, I don't want to say formulaic, but there was a way to go about it, right? And in a way, the state and the police and the government were very involved because they were the ones allowing it to go forward.
Yeah, and the really stunning thing about this is in 2023, today, when the government talks about what happened in 2019, it's all like black riots, violent protests, whatever, totally kind of forgetting the early iterations of these, which were very orderly, which were praised by the government actually for being so orderly and so, civil, and for people, expressing their views in ways that were allowed under the Basic Law and under, Hong Kong's governance structure.
Yeah, and even ignoring the evolution of the 2019 demonstrations.
Yeah.
One of the things that, many of us have followed this, very closely, and so we've seen plenty of shots. But one of the things that's so striking, certainly for me as an American, is just how many people joined some of these protests. Mm-hmm. And again, if you ever had that kind of level of participation in the United States, the continent would tilt, right? So maybe you could say something about that, the size and diversity of these groups.
Yeah, I think, especially at the kind of three huge, biggest marches, at the beginning, there was such a wide diversity. I think we think about, and later on, a lot of the writing about the protest movement was the youth, angle and bit of it. But certainly you can't get that many people out if it's just, high school and college students. It just doesn't work. So yes, there was a huge, diversity of people in ages, but I also think across socioeconomic class, one of the early sort of narratives that I think Beijing was caught off guard by this, as was the Hong Kong government. I think they were kind of searching for a narrative early on, and one of the things they settled on that was just kind of like disaffected youth. It was like kids that couldn't afford apartments and they didn't see any way of social mobility. I think that's a little bit of it, but we met people who were driving Mercedes Benzes. Not on this book tour. We met someone who was distributing protest supplies from a suite at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. I mean, it wasn't just working class or kind of people that were taking the street youth, right? There was a huge swath socioeconomically as well that were taking part in this, and not all marching or at the front lines, but assisting behind the scenes in a big way. In some ways that were evident at the time, some ways that probably will never be evident, whether it was donating money or assisting with supplies or putting their own professional skills to use. A lot of the flyers and social media campaigns, the people who were designing those, people were like, oh, that look really impressive. It's because the people doing those are, working, high paid people at advertising firms who are using their free time to do this, right? People say, oh, the crowdfunding campaign, it's there must be something behind it because it looks too organized, looks too good. It's yeah, because people who work at HSBC and UBS on their free time, who are very good at Excel and finance, are helping out on this, right? So I think it was not just the age or the socioeconomic class, or it was also the activities and the range of which people were willing to kind of chip in and try to help.
You're talking about the 2019 protests, but much of this is also true for 2014.
Yeah.
And we have business people here in Los Angeles who in 2014 we gathered together and they said, our workers, they go to the office during the day and then at night they're in the street. Yeah. In the night they're joining, they're bringing the skills that got them jobs to that effort. And you highlighted that 2014 is a break in this trend, because in 2014 it was the central question was, will we have direct election of the chief executive? Will the chief executive be chosen by Hong Kong? And maybe you could say something about, why they thought they could have that, those protesters.
Yeah, because quite simply, it was promised under the Basic Law, right? I think it was something that Hong Kong people were always told this was the eventual goal, and the government themselves acknowledged that that was the eventual goal, and that was the end goal for Hong Kong, for there to one day be the direct election of the chief executive and also, members of the Legislative Council, right? And then, in 2014, Beijing, and this was sort of the early years of Xi Jinping, when, there were a lot of analysts and thinkers who still, thought Xi Jinping would be this great globalist and, this, like somebody who would open up China in a big way. I think people really maybe didn't look closely enough at Hong Kong as a sort of barometer, maybe for what was to come later on, right? Because instead of, having a kind of resolution for Hong Kong's next chief executive election that was, based on a sort of direct, one man, one vote system, Beijing came up with this sort of convoluted white paper, which involved essentially screening candidates before they could be voted on. And I think a lot of people saw that as a huge, slap in the face. I think that's why Reverend Chu's and that generation's, story is very interesting, because that was what they had been really working on, since the beginning, right? Since before 1997. They were organizing a civil society. They were organizing each other, for this idea that, okay, fine, we weren't involved in the handover negotiations. We didn't have a say then, but now we will. And eventually we will. And we want to be ready. We want to be ready for when we can vote for our own leader. That didn't happen. Instead, we got Carrie Lam and,
And what follows. And Reverend Chu is such a fascinating story because of his experiences on the mainland and his experiences as a accidental activist. He's a minister and becomes involved in a number of things, including providing health care, getting this hospital created. Well, let's get down to it. The bulk of the book, the thing that's magical about it is it manages to convey this broad past and how people's awareness of this past shapes what happens in 2019. And you've already mentioned Carrie Lam, and the chapter is the leader who killed her city, something like this. Mm-hmm. So, but you're very generous towards Carrie Lam in terms of who she, within the bounds of this, in terms of her strengths and maybe she seemed to have a political sense at one point that completely abandoned her later on. So maybe you could say something about Carrie Lam, and then we'll go to the extradition bill.
Yeah, I mean, Carrie Lam, when she came into office, I think there was high hopes for her because CY Leung had been so toxic, and not just in the way, he was just so...
So the previous chief executive.
Yeah, was so combative, and so it continues to be to this day, if you guys follow him on Facebook. It was just so kind of, just really disliked, not just by pro-democracy advocates or those parties, but by a large swath of Hong Kong's population had thus, kind of soured on him. At the last minute when he, for family reasons, decided not to run, I think everyone can read that as he's told that he was not going to be able to run for a second term. When Carrie Lam stepped up or was picked, I think there was a sense of relief. In Hong Kong, we always talk about this, there's the diplomats who represent the foreign countries, and then there's the business chambers who are probably the second set of diplomats and perhaps even more powerful in some ways in terms of foreign interest in the city. And they really liked her. She had come from this finance background. By all telling, she has a sort of almost photographic memory of numbers, and she was, the business community liked the way that she talked about kind of settling things down and getting things back to kind of normal after CY. So when she came in, there was things before that in her past kind of career that were probably more red flags, but at least at that point, I think there was a general consensus that she was going to come in. She was going to kind of handle the business community. She was going to get things back on track. So there wasn't a huge amount of kind of controversy. She was the first female. So there was this kind of nice, news story there. And nothing, I mean, looking to her past now, I think you can see some things. But at the time, overall, people were pretty satisfied with her kind of coming into the role.
Yeah, she had seemed to be a competent official.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Competent bureaucrat. Maybe in the mold of Anson Chan, is now quite on the other side of this. But you have that, and she's not doing especially well as chief executive, and then she initiates this extradition bill. And you do a wonderful job in the book talking about, the story that winds up illustrating the government's case for it.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's really quite moving. But why does she do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for Hong Kong chief executives, the most elusive thing is the second term, right? That is sort of the mandate, the stamp of approval from Beijing that you did so well in the first term and you get another. And I think, Carrie Lam was sort of singularly obsessed with that. We
Let me interrupt for just a second. And how many chief executives have managed to have 2 complete terms?
None. So I think she really had this sort of like top girl kind of personality, like always wanting to be the one to like show her boss that she's doing such a great job. And actually, in the initial years or the initial months really of her term of her leadership, she actually managed to pull off quite a lot of things that Beijing wanted, right? She managed to deliver the West Kowloon high-speed rail station, which opened with this pretty stunning co-location arrangement, right, where you could have mainland police and Hong Kong police operating within the territory, the Hong Kong territory for the first time. They literally like drew a line, and that side was mainland China, and that side was Hong Kong, even though we were still in Hong Kong, right? And that was something that I think, people expected big protests and stuff, and it never really materialized, and she could deliver that. That there was a sense after 2014, the umbrella movement sort of ended, that the leadership of that, were sort of beaten down, they were imprisoned, and momentum had slowed, right? So I think Carrie Lam was kind of obsessing with, surveys and stats and data, and she looked at her polling a lot, and she kind of looked at things you cited, right, of like how Hong Kong people feel about the government, how they feel about their own agency, and she felt like things were at a lull. And so in that lull, when this, horrible case happened, which was the murder of a woman in Taiwan by her boyfriend, and because that happened.
A Hong Kong couple.
Yes.
A Hong Kong couple, and then he came back to Hong Kong and confessed to her murder, but it had been carried out in Taiwan, so there was no extradition arrangement between those two territories because of the complex dynamics between the mainland Taiwan and Hong Kong, and he couldn't be extradited to Taiwan for his crime. I think she saw that as a perfect opportunity to kind of use this very awful, very sad case to kind of show Beijing that she could deliver on something that was elusive, but probably something that would make them very happy, which was to kind of extradite criminals from Hong Kong to the mainland.
Not everybody in Hong Kong is on board with this. The initial protests, aren't led necessarily by students, but by business people.
Yeah, one of the original file against it came from a businessman who's wanted and still wanted in Macau for bribing officials for property deals. He left Macau, now resides in Hong Kong. He was very afraid that if this came through, then he would be sent back to Macau to face almost certain prison time. So he filed a court move against it. Other I guess we could say pro-Beijing or business officials were quite concerned because they had come of age or their family had made their fortune primarily in the mainland in garment manufacturing and property when bribes and corruption were just part of business. And they were afraid that some of that stuff could get dredged up and they could end up facing charges in the mainland or could be brought back there, or probably more probable is that they could get squeezed by business partners, on the mainland who could hang this over their head and say, oh, remember when you paid me that bribe, and things like that. So
and it's not just theoretical. Some people in Hong Kong had the experience.
Yes, absolutely, right? There had been mainland, people...
Unofficial extradition.
Unofficial extraditions, taken out of the Four Seasons with a, bag put over your head and rushed over the border, right? So this was not an abstract. Interestingly, it wasn't an abstract mostly to business guys, right? They were the ones, and then there was, of course, the case of the booksellers that touched a big, nerve among people in Hong Kong. So this was not totally, again, kind of like abstract in the nebulous thing. There were, things to point at and say, wow, that, we don't want that to happen. So originally a lot of the pushback came from Hong Kong businessmen, pro-Beijing businessmen, and then it kind of grew to the international chambers of commerce, diplomats, and then at that same time as that was happening, obviously the Hong Kong, general population was growing more and more concerned about it.
And so you have these protests where families are participating. You start off with business folks, including foreign business.
Yeah.
And the government listens to them. You identified them as a power center. And so you get these carve-outs for certain things.
Yeah.
But the protests grow.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody like Tommy, he doesn't see this as his issue.
Yeah.
But he becomes part of things.
Yeah, the carve-outs, what they did was just to fill it in, is they carved out some of the biggest issues that businessmen were worried about, and they cut them out of the extradition bill, which in a way appeased powerful rich people and really annoyed a larger set of the population, right? By doing this, they're saying, okay, they're only, again...
But we listen to some people.
Yeah, we listen to the tycoons, right? And we listen to the big, the landed gentry, essentially, of the Hong Kong elites. Then you have people like Tommy's another character in the book, or subject in the book, who starts off as very apolitical, not interested in politics very, very much. And kind of grows, you see his interest and then kind of his radicalism grow, as the protests grow. And I think got brought in as, the broader concern spread, and it became not just about the extradition bill, but also just the erosion of this kind of judicial firewall between Hong Kong and the mainland. Some people describe the law now in a way that it sticks as a Trojan horse, right? It would come in, and then it would be a lot of dominoes would fall afterwards.
And I think what had also happened in that by 2019 was that Hong Kong people were so sure in their identity and their sense of themselves, right? So in opposition, like when it seemed that Beijing was sort of eroding what that meant, or sort of taking away the kind of cherished courts and kind of further and further like encroaching, right? I mean, I think people felt like, okay, as Hong Kongers, like we have to stand up, and I think that was something that we heard on the streets a lot and constantly. I often like looked back to my, my notes. I took notes on my phone a lot on the streets because it was hard to manage notebooks and pens and stuff. And people, like the phrase that kept repeating over and over again each weekend was, if we don't come out now, we'll never have a chance to again, right? And that was true from like June of 2019 to sort of January to 2020, until it became really true that Hong Kong people couldn't really come out to the streets again in sort of the same way.
June 1st, 2020 is the last police authorized or police permitted protest. And that comes through. You've got a line in the book about the last stand of an in-between place. And that's really quite poetic in reflecting what people thought and what may prove to be the case.
Shibani probably wrote that line, if it's pathetic. I'm sorry, poetic, poetic. I think, I think that played out, not just amongst, people in Hong Kong and China. There was just this added bit of when this was going on, that the U.S. was getting much more skeptical of Hong Kong as this, some people describe it as an in-between or a link. I think that the metaphor or what people say is it was kind of a cushion between two places that were sort of, in conflict in a way. Certainly in the past few years through 2019, 2020, I think there was a lot more skepticism about it, right? On the U.S. government side, there was a lot more skepticism of, HSBC. Once this is held up as this great institution, all of a sudden the people in the U.S. are saying, well, now they have two central banks, right? They can put their money through HSBC and the Bank of China, right? There was like all the things that were once seen as kind of positive and great for Hong Kong were now being seen as with great skepticism, negativity from mostly kind of the U.S. side, but then China was also viewing Hong Kong in that same way, right? The internationalness was all of a sudden, maybe a base of subversion, right? The internationalness of the city was now a problem. It was too westernized, and they hadn't shed their colonial mindset, right? So I think that was a big change on both sides as well.
Now, one of the striking things, after 2014, we interacted with a number of people, and many people from the mainland were actually sympathetic, not to the cause of direct election. They saw Hong Kong identity as already separate, and that offended. That offended many people who saw it. Well, wait, are you offended by me then? Are you? And that became an issue. So you have this identity at the center of this. Now, one of the things we see through your magnificent book is the hardening of lines. As the police become much more antagonistic towards all of this, and they begin to use more dramatic measures. And again, you folks can speak to where it begins and all of that sort of thing in this chicken and the egg discussion. But you also have radicalization, and in terms of the Braves, the people out in front, and this all comes to a brutal head. Maybe you could say something about the hardening of these lines.
Yeah, I think one of the most stunning things, for anybody who was sort of watching the protests very closely during that period was the sort of very over-the-top police response that we saw pretty much right away from June 12, 2019. And I think, if there was any one singular thing, like if Carrie Lam's sort of role kind of kicked off the whole thing, the police and the police response then really kind of like kicked it up a notch to where you saw this, radicalization happening on the streets, and then the radicalization happening on the police force, and they sort of worked together to keep building and building and building until it sort of, kind of reached a sort of crescendo probably exactly 4 years ago in November 2019 when students laid siege to universities across Hong Kong. And it was just this really kind of like stunning thing to kind of take a step back and look at it in its totality. I think even today, talking to people, I don't think we realize like quite how close Hong Kong got to serious violence, right? Like, more than just the handful of people who passed away during that time period. And I think that was one of the things we were very, very interested in kind of understanding, right, through our characters or through the people in the book, especially Tommy, like what leads somebody to become radicalized, right? How do you get from class clown, don't really care about very much, illegally drinking Long Island iced teas at your neighborhood bar, to like throwing eggs at a police station, to like making Molotov cocktails, to like wanting to seriously hurt a police officer, right? Like what got us to that point, And I think, hopefully some of the sort of characters in our book kind of can speak to that. And yeah, I think that was sort of at the heart of what we wanted to kind of look into.
I think the bit that you touched on the mainland, I'll just say, we approach this as reporters, and I don't think we were trying to portray this movement as totally without flaws and without issues and without moments, that very ugly moments. And some of that certainly was directed at people from the mainland. There was some terrible xenophobia and kind of horrible moments, a few in particular, of violence towards people from the mainland, or even perceived to be from the mainland, in Hong Kong. I think something that we also saw and that we continue to see and hear from people is that there was people from the mainland who came and took part in these protests. Obviously, they didn't broadcast that in the way that other people did. It's just not possible without huge repercussions for them. And so I think that there certainly was, like you said, that the tension is there, and at times it bubbled over into something that was, not, was totally unpalatable.
I don't speak Cantonese, so I'm going to get this wrong. I could give it in Mandarin, but lam cao.
Yeah.
And we get to bring Finn from abroad into this kind of discussion, and maybe you could say something about the ramping up. Yeah. So we will burn together. Yeah,
essentially, lam chao is the ideology that Finn Lau kind of first sort of.
Tell us who Finn Lau is.
Oh yes, yeah. Finn Lau is one of the 4 characters in our book. He's an overseas activist who was in the UK when it started, was very involved on online forums, and before he posted one big post, he changed his handle to I want lam chao, which is basically a gambling terminology in Hong Kong, which sort of means was translated into the sort of line from the Hunger Games, which is if we burn, you burn with us. And I think we talked a lot about 2014 and 2003 and like kind of the early victories and then sort of the door being shut in the face of Hong Kongers. I think Lam Chao is an ideology that came in response to that, right? Like if you don't want to listen to us and if we feel like, hopeless and we can't change anything, then we will make you suffer as much as we are suffering now, right? And I think, people have asked us about this a little bit on in other talks. And I think one of the real, at least as Finn and some of the other overseas activists saw it, wasn't just sort of like burn things down on the streets, right? Or sort of do like violence on the streets. It was also, how do we topple Hong Kong's international relations? How do we change the sort of things that underlie Hong Kong's ability to function as a financial center, right? And that was, sanctions. That was, trying to get the UK to say the Sino-British Declaration was breached and no longer held. And that was, I think they hoped in the long term that would also mean sanctions against, financial institutions, which never happened, right? But, you did see them achieve a tremendous amount, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we were based in Myanmar for part of our careers, and we saw sanctions being put into place there, but they took so long, right? And they were so like, even today, where there's been obviously a coup in Myanmar, right? And there's like calls for more sort of entities to be sanctioned to kind of control that. It's like trudging along. In Hong Kong, when there were calls for sanctions, Tim and I were like, yeah, this will take 1 year,
this
2
is
years.
never gonna happen.
6 months later, Carrie Lam and a whole crew of other officials were sanctioned, right? It was pretty stunning to see, that sort of materialize in such a short span of time.
And so that, again, one of the things that made Hong Kong distinct, right? The notion that it had a legal system and that it was accorded different kinds of treatment.
Yeah.
By these major powers. Two last questions. So one, you highlighted how Beijing began to see this and how Beijing described this as an American effort at a color revolution.
Yeah.
And did that land with anyone in Hong Kong?
So I think at the beginning, like I said, they were kind of caught off guard, and at first we saw this economic issue kind of being floated by Beijing, like a softer line, and then they're saying, oh, we'll fix the housing and stuff, or try to do that.
Yeah, the assumption was, again, these disaffected youth.
Right.
If we can bring down the house, build more houses, make it more affordable.
And then maybe in August, I guess, you saw this kind of hard turn when it became like this was the U.S. is doing, and then also maybe they weren't so vocal about it, but also that the UK was kind of meddling, that they never really left, that they were still there and colonizing and things like that. Did it land? I think there's some people certainly, who believe the U.S. involvement, but I think that's evolved. I think at first, when they talk about like the U.S. involvement, it was like CIA guys with bags of cash like paying the protesters. That obviously never happened, right? So then and then that kind of started to shift to say like, oh well, U.S. senators visited. That's U.S. involvement. So I think we see this kind of always shifting of the goalposts to sort of make it fit. What kind of Beijing and the pro-Beijing officials in Hong Kong, like kind of how they're changing it. It started out as this hard thing, and now it's kind of shifted to mean much more than that.
Yep.
Yeah, my perception of that was that it was mainly aimed at the China audience.
Right.
Yes,
and to a certain extent, folks who were inclined to hear that argument
totally,
in other places.
Yeah, I mean,
not really a Hong Kong audience.
I mean, somebody told us that Carrie Lam herself was like said that the color revolution stuff was nonsense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they knew their role in this, right?
Yeah.
They knew that what their city felt. But you're right. I mean, Beijing, on the other hand, I think was absolutely convinced, especially this was the Trump administration. This was when, all the talk about, being, Trump being so tough on China, like sort of unprecedented sort of, new, Washington policy approach towards China. I think in that context, they really thought, they're using Hong Kong as a way to, cause the fall of the CCP. I mean, I really think they were convinced.
Yeah, and that's been a standard argument that the United States and other players don't really care about human rights and don't care about these things, but simply use it as a tool with which to bang Beijing, a wedge. So my last question, and then everybody else gets to chime in. My last question is, even though the two of you met, I guess, in Myanmar, and your relationship bloomed in what couldn't have been easy circumstances, and then you go, in 2018 or so to Hong Kong and begin to work there. How did this change you? How did reporting this? And so that doesn't, that's not what the book is about. It's not about Shibani and Tim go to Hong Kong. It's not
deliberate. Nobody wants to read that book.
Yeah, it's
not that interesting.
It's not that book, but I'm wondering what it's given you and maybe what it's taken away.
Well, I think in terms of what it's given us, I would say that like the expectation of Hong Kong versus what happened in Hong Kong probably was the most stark of any kind of reporting assignment I've sort of ever had. I mean, there was this idea when the Washington Post, set up our bureau that all the chaos would be in Southeast Asia, places like Myanmar, Cambodia, blah, 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 and Hong Kong would be this like quiet place. You get to like sit and collect your thoughts and write and, take your time to do that. Obviously that wasn't true. But I think, sort of personally for Tim and I, right, like, and I think the wider Hong Kong journalist community, I think we were all responding very, very quickly to what was happening on the ground. We were sort of, having to learn, very quickly what it meant to sort of like check each other's, gas masks and make sure there weren't leaks, and sort of, we were all part of these like groups on Telegram and on WhatsApp where, the protests were so big, right? They were happening kind of everywhere, and sort of people would tell each other, okay, like something's happening here, something's happening there.
And that was part of the strategy, be like water.
Exactly. And the journalists had to be like water too, right? We had to like crowdsource and do a lot of that. And I think obviously when the pandemic hit, and then, when the national security law came into place, and when all of that happened, I think we felt like we were in this like this sort of front seat of history when other people were not, because people couldn't come in, right? Hong Kong's borders were closed, and we felt like every day, like we saw this horrific, stuff happening, and our contacts, our friends, our colleagues, go to jail, and it was quite stark. And I think, when we decided to do this book, I think we kind of knew that it would sort of mean that we would not be able to be based in Hong Kong, or perhaps even return, also to protect our own sources, and to make sure that the people who shared all this stuff with our book also are safe. And so in terms of what that's taken away, I mean, had things been different, I mean, we probably would still be in Hong Kong today, as would many people, right? And I think the sort of the sort of feeling of sort of losing that city, I think we can speak to like 1% compared to like the people in our book who can speak to it 1,000%. But I think that is, I mean, it is sad, but yeah.
Thanks for this, but thank you for coming here and sharing with us, what went into this.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So much for coming.
Thank you.